Welcome, good evening. I'm delighted to welcome you to this York Festival of Ideas event. My name is Mary Garrison, and I'm a lecturer in early medieval history at the university here. I'll be chairing the event, and it's a great pleasure to see you all here. It's a great pleasure to introduce tonight's first speaker, Michelle Brown. Michelle Brown is Professor Emerita of Medieval Manuscript Studies at the School of Advanced Study, University of London, and a visiting professor at University College London. She's a patron of the Society of Bookbinders and an honorary lay canon of Truro Cathedral. She was formerly the curator of Illuminated Manuscripts at the British Library and a lay canon and chapter member of St. Paul's Cathedral, London. She has published, lectured, and broadcast widely, combining expert, exacting knowledge of medieval manuscripts with the ability to bring them to life in their cultural, religious, intellectual, and political contexts. This evening, Michelle is going to explore the history of medieval Britain through the biographies of illuminated manuscripts. The newest book is here. After the talk, there will be a chance to buy signed copies of the book and a drinks reception downstairs. Michelle, over to you.
Thank you very, very much for coming, and especially on such a lovely evening. But hey, what a venue. Right, this is the first time I've actually seen the book, so it got here ahead of me. So this is the book launch tonight, and thank you for coming. And thank you to Sarah and the whole of the team for having me back to what is an incredible part of the landscape of culture in York and in our country. So thank you very much. Now, having taught medieval history, art history, and book history since what feels like the late Middle Ages, I thought I'd experiment on you all and actually combine them and see what the history of England, Britain, it goes in between, actually looks like from the perspective of those who owned, commissioned, and made some of the great illuminated manuscripts. They present a very original and quite intimate canvas in which we can use the biography of the book and of its makers and users as Virgils to actually guide us through the main themes of 1,000 years of history. So for those of you who remember 1066 and all that, those of you who more recently know horrible histories, it's an academic's attempt to actually try and make history enjoyable, intriguing, and aesthetically stimulating, which of course we all know it is. Now, I've got far too much material. I feel rather seasick already on this wonderful, raking Merchant adventurer's deck, and you're going to feel equally seasick by the time I've whizzed through the slides. Some of them are going to pass in a blur. Mary, that's going to be interesting for you to interpret. But I will tell you why I'm showing those images and what they tell us about history that we might otherwise not see in such an intimate way. Okay. There we go. So we're going to start in the beginning of the 8th century with Bishop Eadfrith of Lindisfarne's Desert of the Book. And this is the Lindisfarne Gospels in the British Library, Cotton Nero D4. Now, as I'm sure you know, the Lindisfarne Gospels we think was made to form the focal point of the Shrine of St. Cuthbert, which already in 709 was attracting 8- and 9-year-old unaccompanied children from Ireland to visit what was to be the most visited shrine in the West until that of Thomas Becket at the end of the 12th century. If you wanted a chance to get your social media message out there, this was the most seen place of public assembly of its age. And the visuals, which have often been dismissed in pastime catalogues as Celtic, and by Strutt, who first mentioned it in print in the 1750s, hot off the boat from the grand tour of Italy, having seen far too many naked gods and goddesses, and described it as a monstrous barbarity. With the lens of 20th century art appreciation, we can see now that it's a very, very complex essay in symbolism and abstraction and philosophical aesthetic concepts. So we're going to have a little look at this. The Shrine of Cuthbert, of course, still exists in the cathedral at Durham, which we've moved to recently. And this is me laying the facsimile on Cuthbert's tomb in 2003. Now, my research, having been taken to see it by an Irish dad and Northumbrian Mackham mum when I was 4, and seeing it in Snow White's glass coffin, it just reached out and pulled me in. The tentacles of interlace and the spiral work of Latin just all drew me in. And I wrote in my diary that night that instead of being an astronaut, I was going to be a librarian. And here we are. Okay, now something for the home team. Of course, in 306, the Emperor Constantine was proclaimed by his troops in York, essentially a military coup. Dad had been a successful general, he was shaping up well, and the current government was something that many felt needed to be replaced. Now, as you know, when he pulls a lot of the troops out and marches on Rome, he pauses on the Milvian Bridge, looks up at Apollo's sun, sees the cross superimposed on it, and subsequently starts with his colleague in the East, Licinius, passing edicts of religious toleration for all faiths, including Christianity, which had been quite rigorously persecuted previously. By the 380s, of course, Christianity had become the state religion of Rome. And we start finding artistic expressions of that. If you look at some of the mosaics of the late 4th century, such as this one from Hinton St. Mary in Dorset, you can see what would normally have been Apollo on your dining room mosaic carpet. But now the inclusion of the Cairo, the first 2 letters of the word Christus in Greek, and a nimbus, and the pomegranate, the antique symbol of eternal life, proclaim it as Christ. Of course, in 410, the Honorian rescript, a peculiar form of reverse Brexit, unties us from the Roman Empire and tells us to look to our own finances and defences. There is a period of continuum. However, before we get to that, one of the things, of course, that Constantine does is write a letter to his bishop in Caesarea, Eusebius, asking him to provide 50 copies of scripture to put on the high altars of the incredible churches that he is building, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Nativity. You can't put a scrofulous wax tablet or papyrus scroll on a high altar and have it make impact. And of course, the Romans, being a methodical crowd, wanted to know what it was they were signing up to. Imagine the publication dilemma for Eusebius to have to, if you like, invent the deluxe codex, which is still pretty much a fairly low caliber, cheap and cheerful Christian slip in your pocket and run quick solution, and turn that into something that's going to look impressive, and also to begin the process of stabilising a canon of scripture, which goes on until at least 600 and the century following. Now, if we look at Codex Sinaiticus, and then we look what is produced on Holy Island, roughly the border between England and Scotland today, near Berwick-on-Tweed, Lindisfarne, we can see that something's happened. Now, my research, there's been a lot of debate, but my research will date it to 715 to 22. And those dates are bordered by liturgical lection systems that are recorded there, including a new one from Rome, which only makes it into the pages of books made in Rome in 715, a convergence of events whereby a number of schismatic and heretical churches around Christendom are all reunited into universal orthodoxy, including Iona, the bastion of Columban traditions, and his monks, of course, had founded Lindisfarne in 635. And the terminus is Bishop Eadfrith of Lindisfarne's death in 732. This incredible book, which has amongst the highest production values that I've ever encountered in my career, is entirely made by one person. Okay, you've got one artist scribe. And if I'm correct, and it was the busy bishop who has to undertake hard manual labour every day to prove his humility, who's running a diocese of Islandshire that stretches up to the Firth of Forth, who's providing the health, the education, the pastoral care for a massive area, who's engaged in quite delicate diplomatic relations with secular and other church leaders, and who basically, as somebody following the Eastern eremitic rules and orders of the Columban Federation, as a seniores, is one of the few who could be entrusted with being the Judaic scribe of Scripture, a sofer, somebody who could write logos, the word of God. And as we'll see, he chooses to do that not in a scriptorium, but on a lump of rock in the North Sea, where for the 40 days of Advent and the 40 days of Lent, even the busy bishop was allowed to go on spiritual retreat, which is why I've called it Preaching with the Pen in the Desert of the Book. It's a remarkable spirituality, and born of trade routes around the western Atlantic seaboard of these islands, which extend right back into the Neolithic period, and which, with the excavations at Tintagel that I've been involved in recently, we're finding that it's only really around 900 that the Viking control of the northern seaways strategically disrupts and alters the focus of that ancient route from east to west. So forget the Channel Tunnel and Heathrow, etc. There's a different focus coming into play there. But of course, the missions to convert the pagan Germanic peoples and others who flocked into the wreckage of Britannia after the army and much of the civil service had withdrawn, included those from Rome, Augustine, who arrives in Canterbury reluctantly in 597, having turned back 6 times, as every dinner table he stopped at in Europe said, "You don't want to go there." And bishops from Gaul, such as Felix, others. So it's a mixed thing from Ireland, South Wales, Eastern traditions coming in, continental traditions coming in. But bear in mind that when the different traditions come into impact and controversy and result in a synod in 664, hosted by that wonderful woman and diplomat Hild of Whitby, it's often presented as Celtic versus Roman. The Roman camp wins, the Celts go off in a strop. Not at all, not at all. We're not talking Roman Catholicism. The Pope is the westernmost of the Eastern patriarchs. He's the poor relation. Gregory of the Great, who St. Augustine wrote to the boss in Constantinople saying, "Why have I been left as the captain of the leaky ship of the West? I want to go to Sinai and be a hermit and have icons and incense." And of course, orthodoxy is the norm until the 10th century, although the last 2 centuries there are degrees of separation. And the Columban Church has its own distinctive traditions. Columba, a prince of the Aeneal, has his own particular rule and way of doing things, probably very different to that of Palladius, who already in 431 was sent from Rome by the Pope to those who were already practicing Christianity in Southeast Ireland, probably on the back of trade relationships. Okay, so it's a complex jigsaw, but ultimately the decision was we're going to go universal. We're not going to be a local church for local people. That's partly a secular decision and partly one to reaffirm the harmony and integration of the Christian faith. And this book comes to represent those agendas. Warlords, might is right, extortionists, rapists, many of them, finally being turned and transformed by a new ethos, and the advantages of being part of an international network with a diplomatic and a literate bureaucracy at their disposal, actually are transformed, whether they will or not, many of them, into more stable rulers. And the figure who comes to represent a lot of that process is St. Cuthbert, a bishop of Lindisfarne, who, when he's elected, doesn't immediately go to the equivalent of Lambeth Palace, but goes as a hermit on a rock in the inner farm, outside the king's bedroom window, as a constant reminder to a man intent on the genocide of his British neighbours and military attacks on fellow Orthodox Christian states, and whose wife has run away basically because she can't bear to consummate and goes off and founds Ely. Not a happy home life. But anyway, what we get out of that is Cuthbert modelling to the king and his people the responsibility that comes with power. And so this is what the maker of the book, Bishop Eadfrith, who along with Bede was instrumental in shaping the cult of Cuthbert during the first quarter of the 8th century, is having to somehow present in a book which, along with the coffin of Cuthbert with his relics intact inside, form the focal point of this new shrine. You might not have understood it all when you finally got your 5 minutes in front of the actual object, but you'd have had audio guides. They're called people. They would have explained. And that, of course, was Holy Island. And the big fish eating little fish process had advanced to such an extent by 700 that there were several major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms rather than the hundreds in the initial 2 centuries or so. And of course, when we look at the grave goods from something like Sutton Hoo in East Anglia, dated by its coinage to around 620, and possibly the ceremonial grave of King Redvald of East Anglia, who is forced to convert by his godfather, in every sense, King Ethelbert of Kent, whose wife is a Christian from Gaul and who has nagged him long enough to let Augustine and co in. He gets Redvald, the next in line on the power stakes, to come and be baptised. And Bede says, rather tongue-in-cheek, and he took his baptism gifts and put them in the temple alongside everything else. And so a number of our key prestigious burials, such as Sutton Hoo, Prittlewell, Taplow, etc., have a number of Christian-orientated grave goods in with their pagan assembly. And rather like the pages of the openings of each gospel in the Lindisfarne Gospels, those graves represent the cultural and economic aspirations of that person and the people whom he or she led. Okay? And so, if you're creating a mirror of Christian ethos aspiration for what you want the world to look like, what are you going to put in the pages of your Sutton Hoo manuscript boat? Okay? And this is what Eadfrith does. And these are the buggers that they're actually having to contend with. And it came as a cost. Many of the kings who converted and many of the missionaries were martyred, as we know. Columba coming to Iona, and the model of eremitic Eastern monasticism that is brought there is very much an eremitic form of individuals in community coming together to worship, but spending a lot of their time in individual prayer and spiritual acts and study, and very much working out of that community, unless they were hermits, into the wider world. And whole communities of lay people would be attached to them to live God-centred lives. They would also function as open prisons. You'd have quite a few felons on places like Lindisfarne doing community payback, often with violent repercussion. Augustine, this is the Augustine Gospels. You'd meet many other books in each chapter, not just the key book. And this is a book that we think Augustine brought with him from Rome in 597. And you can see those portals either side of St. Luke with images from Holy Week, looking very much like the 5th century doors of Santa Sabina in Rome, where Gregory and Augustine met to plan much of the mission. And so around this time, a big landmark in Western art history is that Gregory writes a letter to Cyrenus, Bishop of Marseille, saying, "Stop knocking the heads off of statues. In images the illiterate read." And with the subsequent concerns of iconoclasm, it left a door open within Western art for figural expressions. But of course the response and the insular world of Britain and Ireland do much to foster this, is that they pick up on the concept of rabbinic pardes, that you don't just have the literal meaning of the thing. You don't just create a film storyboard. You might do that sometimes if you're really wanting to get the message across, but mostly you want to dig deeper into the text and into yourself to reach that small voice of calm. And the way they do it is through incredibly deep meditation, intellectual exercise, number symbolism, geometry, all sorts of tools at their disposal, and all of those are deployed in Lindisfarne. That book you will recognise because it's the one that's trotted out at the installation of the Archbishops of Canterbury to this day, and was used at the Royal Coronation, wasn't it, too, recently? As curators, it's always such a faff telling them not to dribble on the books. Okay. And of course, the response that we have with figures such as Wilfrid is to build incredible edifices, the crypts at Ripon and York, filled with relics, such as we see here. And when Wilfrid of York, who argued the Roman cause at Whitby, when his cult was set out, he has a purple codex dripping with gold and silver that he's picked up on his trips to the continent. And that is so different from what Eadfrith makes for the cult of St. Cuthbert, who Wilfrid is challenging, his successors are challenging at that time. This is something homegrown. This has all of the symbols that you and yours for centuries would have had inked on your arms, on your metalwork, on your textiles, defining who you are, what your status was, what your beliefs were, what your tribal and political affiliations were, readily recognisable, but suddenly set in a landscape that stretches from the deserts of Syria to the west coast of Ireland. And if you imagine dragging your granny 300 miles to the shrine on Holy Island, and you see these pages and they're explained to you, you might be intrigued by the Celtic spiral work that the brooch your great-granny from Ireland had left you, or the writhing zoomorphic interlace on the belt buckle that your great-grandfather, who was a federal auxiliary in the Roman army, had left you. But what on earth are those symbols redolent of different peoples, often still in situations of enmity, doing cohabiting? And what are those strange letters that, oh, they're Greek, they're from Constantinople? And so you get this incredible smorgasbord. If we were to go out to a fusion restaurant tonight of Syrian, Italian, Irish cuisine, the words on the menu would actually summon up cultural Serengetis for us. And so those patterns and ornaments do for highly visually literate oral societies. Okay. We also, of course, have other figures on the board. Benedict Biscop, who undertook 6 journeys to Rome and salvaged the remnants of the late antique and early Christian libraries to such an extent that the library he built at his monasteries of Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow in the 670s and 80s, and you can see the surviving 7th century structure and stained glass from both of those centres, which still survive. The library, he found, enables a little boy, age 7, Bede, who stays there until he's 62 and makes a mental journey to the Middle East, writing the best Baedeker guide to the holy places that's still used in the 20th century, who works out gravitational pull of the moon and writes the first tide timetables, who writes the first history of the English church and people, and who normalises a unified dating system of CE, BCE, etc., amongst his other attainments in at least 40 to possibly 60 books. It's a remarkable achievement. And one of the books made there, the Codex Amiatinus, taken as a gift to the Pope in 716, which is more a building than a book. Imagine carting that over the Alps, literally, yeah? Is actually designed to say, what books do you have on the shelves and what editions of those books? And when at the Counter-Reformation, many scholars were brought together to try and find a printable version of the Latin Vulgate edition that Jerome had undertaken in Bethlehem in 380s, they found that this book, made in Northumbria, a mere 60 years or so after it had been the equivalent of the Wild West, was the best reconstruction, not copy, reconstruction of Jerome's research methodology. And Bede, meanwhile, was translating John into English, the first translation of any part of the Bible into the English language, and telling the Archbishop of York he really ought to let people say the Paternoster and the Creed in English. There you go. Okay. And that book, of course, influences Lindisfarne. Bede is a guiding hand, although Eadfrith conceives and makes the book. And the output of this are things like Together. These churchmen from Iona, Monk Weymouth Jarrow and Lindisfarne do incredible things. They pass the first law in the world protecting women and children in warfare. We could do with their like today. They enter documents into the margins of books like the Lindisfarne Gospels, freeing slaves, the beginning of the abolition movement. Put your money where your mouth is. Don't just talk the talk, walk the walk of the new religion. And so that, for me, is part of what is so inspiring about the Lindisfarne Gospels. When we look at each of its cross-carpet pages, at the beginning of each Gospel, each one has a different cross. Matthew, the Latin cross, Mark, the Celtic ringhead, Luke, the Greek doctor, has the Greek cross, and John, the mystic, has the Coptic and Ethiopic T-shaped Tau cross. 4 different churchmanships from different corners of the world, with on the pages opposite different alphabet types, Latin, Greek, Ogham, runes, coming together to say different voices, like the 4 different evangelists, all in harmony together. Hadn't been achieved yet, but it was a brave vision. And Logos. If you believe in Christianity, God doesn't, or Judaism, God doesn't have to be depicted as an old man with a grey beard. This, to me, is a far more successful rendition of the cosmic Logos. And those designs are done entirely sensitive to the problems with iconoclasm in Byzantium, are done entirely using Pythagorean and Euclidean geometry, number symbolism, etc. And I think what they're doing here, and what Bede vocalises, is a Neoplatonic concept of truth equals beauty equals God. And one of the best ways of doing that is observing the physics of the natural world and the working of geometry and mathematics, and as with music, you create a perfect harmony. I haven't got time to talk about it all. By the 13th century, Islam and Judaism were experimenting with similar concepts, but not this early. The diptychs of beardies and clean-shaven in the evangelist portraits aren't just Byzantine and Roman exemplars. It's a subtle diptych resolving 3 centuries of conflict. How can Christ be human and divine at the same time? Well, because the human will can never disobey the divine will, and Christ accepted birth, he accepted crucifixion, therefore the 2 evangelists that represent Matthew, the man, incarnation, and Luke, the sacrificial victim, the calf or bull of the crucifix, are shown aging and mortal and human, and the 2 clean-shaven, Mark, the Lion of Judah, kingship and resurrection, and John the divine, whose eagle flies direct to the throne of God, you can read that in Bede and Augustine and Gregory, are clean-shaven and immortal. Neat visual diptych like St. Patrick and the 3-leaf shamrock for the Trinity. Job done. And the council that did that was held in Hatfield in England in 789, prior to the biggie in Constantinople in 681. We weren't peripheral, we were now where it was at. Didn't last long, but hey. And this is where the book was made, on Cuddy Island. And on the back, you can see Eadfrith invented lead pencil and a light box so that he could draw on one side with complex geometric and numerological symbolism, and could then, through a light box, have light shining through, so that when he put the layers of paint on the other side of the page, he didn't lose those carefully constructed drawings. And to live as Bear Grylls on that island for 80 days of the year, whilst running that diocese, you'd have been inspired by things like Columbus, an Irish saint who around 600 said, "Nature is a second scripture in which we perceive God." And lo and behold, when we did the digital facsimile, you can see all those images online at the British Library still. When we did that, Photoshop says there's 90 colours. The silk route would be hard put to muster 90 colours. And when we did a non-destructive Raman analysis that I led, we found Eadfrith did it by using 6 local rocks and plants at his feet. He can get 40 shades of purple out of the lichen that grows on that rock by adding acidity and alkalinity. And that's because, not just aesthetics, because his best buddy Bede has just written a commentary on the tabernacle and temple, saying the 40 shades of purple that the temple curtains were dyed with represent the journey of the just soul. A monstrous barbarity. And when we look at Eadfrith's vision of eternal harmony throughout the multiverse, it's perhaps not so different from how we visualise today in Through a Glass Darkly with things like the CERN Hadron Collider. Right, that's the sort of thing I do with books, all right? I'm sorry I've done too much on Lindisfarne, but it's my pet love. We then move to the 820s and Mercia, the people of the Marches, the Midlands. And Bishop Athelwold of Lichfield's prayer book, known as the Book of CERN, in Cambridge University Library. Now, Mercia, in the second half of the 8th and early 9th century, becomes top dog in what Bede calls the Bretwalda League of who is the mightiest. And that's largely because they have 3 successive, very powerful rulers. Athelbald, 716 to 57, Offa, 757 to 96, and Kenulf, from 96 to 821. The drawing is, we think, of Athelbald, found in Repton, where the royal mausoleum survives, and where the great Viking overwintering army of the 860s camped. The Biddles did a wonderful excavation there of that, and there we can see one of the coins of King Offa. It's remarkable that it was such a stable dynasty because they were forever killing one another to try and secure the dynasty, and in fact Offa was so successful in trying to get his son as sole survivor. Unfortunately, he only survived him by 114 days. So there you go, man proposes, God disposes, and all that. And the stucco chapel on the banks of the Great Ouse that Offa was buried in was washed away within a year. There you go. But he did a lot of things in the meantime. Okay, and this is the crypt at Repton. Started in Athelbald's time, but enlarged in the 9th century along the lines of St. Peter's with those barley twist of the baldacchino in St. Peter's in Rome, because a royal Mercian saint had been martyred by the Danes, so they wanted to beef that up a bit. And the Staffordshire hoard includes this strip, possibly from a cross, with inscriptions from the Psalm of the Israelites in the time of their trial, with different form of wording on each side. And I worked out that on one side, the side that the bearer would have been protected by, is the form of those words as the Mercian saint Guthlac, a warrior turned hermit at Crowland in the Fens, actually told Ethelbald, "Don't worry, King, it's all going to be all right. You are going to prevail." Okay, so there's an Athelbald connection, I think, in this remarkable assembly of 7th century metalwork. Many suggestions of what that was for. Personally, I subscribe to the fact that it was a metal worker bringing them to his workshop for repurposing. And interestingly enough, there's a bit of a Wallace-Simpson connection here. Well, I think there is. Anyway, in that a lot of the dating controversy was that people wanted to date it 600, and others said, no, there are things there that must be more like 700. And part of that was because there's a retro vibe in Mercian art around 700 that makes things look like 600. And one of the reasons for that is, in that early metalwork from the Sutton Hoo period, you're using big garnets with your gold, which are from India. But by this period, they're having to get the smaller ones from Spain. So what they're doing is taking apart a lot of earlier jewellery, but the style vibe is so strong. If you took apart a Wallace-Simpson Deco sunburst, you'd be stuck with those shapes. And so they start resetting them, and you get a bit of a style retro vibe going on. So you're looking at about 100 years of metalwork there. This is one of the coins of Offa, or rather a medal. This was minted at Tamworth in 754, and it copies one minted the same year in Baghdad by the Sasanian dynasty. And you can see that on his one, underneath the Kufic script that is copied, he's had Offa Rex inscribed. And that's to show the extent of his imperium. And you're talking now about somebody who claimed that he was a cousin of Charlemagne and who went into a trade war with Charlemagne. And at one point, Charlemagne writes back and says, well, you criticised us for the size of our whetstones, but I'm sure that the short length of Mercian cloaks these days aren't anything to do with fashion. And then when Offa claims one of Charlemagne's offsprings for his to marry his, first one's okay, but when the next one is claimed, and that would give his son a claim to the Carolingian imperial throne, Charlemagne calls time and said, hey, cuz, we're not that close. Okay, so we're talking about an interesting period. This is the original Kufic from Baghdad. And it shows that things are travelling very, very quickly as well. Offa is also the first to actually have his queen crowned in his lifetime and to allow her to mint coinage in her own name. This is a bit of an example of the problem with women who break through the glass ceiling, sometimes just wanting to play the same games with bigger balls than the boys, in that she promptly sets about killing any other contenders to her personal authority, including the King of East Anglia, who she's entrapped to try and marry her daughter, who then goes off on pilgrimage to Rome in penance because she can't bear to stay at home with mummy and daddy. Oh, here we go. Now, of the books of this period, the Book of Cerne is one of 4 prayer books. They're the earliest to be arranged thematically until you get medieval books of hours in the mid-13th century. This one was written by and for a Mercian woman, and additions at the end of the book show that it belonged to another Mercian woman who, by the 870s, had married Alfred the Great, Aelswith of Wessex. And at the end of her personal prayer book, which is already 2 generations, an heirloom, at the bottom is written in Old English, these are the lands that Aelswith had in Winchester. And when the Biddles excavated the cathedral close in Winchester, they found the nunnery and the land boundaries accord totally with what's written there. So this probably came with Aelswith's property to the Nunneminster. And another of the books is the Royal Prayer Book in the British Library, and this has a lovely little Syrian senmerv, part bird, part fish, part quadruped, to symbolise the harmony of the elements, which is a very new Eastern import. And it's in a book whose thematic arrangement is around healing, the salus and sanus of mankind, with charms for healing, with practical remedies, with gospel extracts, and written by and for women, possibly a female physician. And the reason we know that, one of the ways, is if you start a masculine prayer, you start it as a peccator, a male sinner. By the time you get to the end, you've transed into a female sinner, a peccatrice, because what the woman is used to hearing has actually transcended what she's supposed to be copying. Okay, and these are some of the strongest evidences for female book production in this period. And bear in mind, by the mid-8th century, Anglo-Saxon women probably had the best legal rights of any women in the world up to the 1930s. And incredible opportunities through roles in the church. The Book of Cerne contains interlinear glosses in places into Old English. Alfred the Great didn't invent Old English. They're doing it much earlier. Bede, on his deathbed in 735, is translating John. But Alfred recognises that actually to put more grit into the English porridge, you've got to actually big up native English culture, and so language and understanding that language in written form is part of that. And there are many other books that are made in Mercia at this time. The Tiberius copy of Bede, this wonderful book from Peterborough, the Barberini Gospels, which includes wonderful canon tables, including something a bit surprising. If you open a copy of the Gospels, you don't normally expect a little man with a very large erection to greet you. But of course, he's apotropaic, like Sheila na Giggs on the walls of Norman churches. He protects the text. And you'll see that his genitals are being threatened by little beasties, as is his beard. An interesting little side thing that we get from some of the books of the period. In the Welsh laws at this time, a man could divorce his woman on the spot, his wife on the spot, if she insulted his beard, because it was his virility. Conversely, girls, she could divorce him on the spot if he got too portly that he was unable to perform his conjugal duties. Here you go. The Vespasian Psalter, made by the nuns of Minster in Thanet, I've argued, in the 730s, who were supplying books for the Germanic mission field. And here we have the openings of each of the gospel extracts in Cerne with their images, like a full gospel book, of the evangelists and their symbols, but with inscriptions that are very peculiarly worded. And that's a bit like, we think we've invented hypertext and intertextuality and hotspots that you can click on. Well, if you saw that vocabulary, it would unlock very key readings that you would have heard during the church year that then open up bigger theological and moral meanings. So although it looks simple, it's quite a sophisticated little package. And it relates to sculptures like this in Peterborough, and this one at Bredon on the Hill in Leicestershire. Only in Britain and Ireland, anywhere in the world, would you get the Byzantine iconography of the Virgin Hodegetria, who's normally shown pointing to the Christ child as the way to eternal life. In Britain and Ireland, often it's shown with a book. Scripture is the incarnation of the divine Logos, the Word. And in Lichfield, about 15 years ago, they found the remains of Chad's tomb. It would have been something like this one in St Andrews, made by Mercian craftsmen, influenced by very plastic styles from Greece. And this is the Lichfield angel. It's just landed from Byzantium, probably part of an Annunciation from the gable end, probably part of the refurb of the shrine in the beginning of the 9th century. Offa, ever one to cut through the Gordian knot, when the Archbishop of Canterbury told him he couldn't have his son co-anointed as joint ruler during his lifetime, simply says, oh, that's all right then, I'll set up my own archbishopric and they'll do it. So for a while, Lichfield was the third archbishopric. When Kenulf, an outsider from Western Mercia, because Offa's killed all of his own immediate relatives, comes to the throne, he reinstates Canterbury, relegates Lichfield, but gives Lichfield lots of gifts of land and probably a newly refurbed shrine as a pilgrimage centre to make up for it. And the colouring on the angel is still there, purples and whites, Bede's colour of the journey of the just soul. And it's reflected in the John, in the Book of Cerne, and also the 8th century gospel book from Lindisfarne, which is preserved there and has the earliest manumissions of slaves entered into it when it went for a stay in Wales in the 9th century in the face of Viking attacks. Haven't time to do this. Sorry about that. This is just to say, when the Vikings are at the door of Kent in the 840s, we're turning out things that pretty much give Charlemagne's court school a run for their money. The Royal Bible, modelled on Santa Apollinare in Classe, and court school manuscripts, as well as insular things. This is one of the court school things for Charlemagne, that it was influenced by, the Golden Gospels. And then in 793, Lindisfarne becomes the first major victim of Viking attacks with incredible bloodshed. But the book and the relics there are saved. And Alcuin writes a letter of condolence from the luxury of Aachen at that point, saying, this is terrible, we're devastated, but you brought it all on yourselves. You weren't following the simple ascetic ways of the Irish founding fathers. Bit rich coming from the palace at Aachen, but there you go. And this book, the Stockholm Codex Aureus, made in Kent in the mid-8th century, in the mid-9th, has an Old English document added in the margins saying that Ealdorman Alfred of Surrey and his wife Werber have redeemed the book from Vikings for bullion and have presented it to the high altar at Canterbury. Now, redeeming books as hostages is an Armenian practice, and it brings you very, very big brownie points for the soul. Okay, their names are written there along with their daughter. We also have his will, which says that much as he loves Werber and their daughter, he's not going to leave them a bean unless she promises that on his death she'll go on pilgrimage to Rome, never remarry, and spend the rest of her days praying for his soul. We don't know if Werber concurred. Oh, I'm running out. I'm sorry. This is going to give you a taster. I'm sorry. I'll come back and do another one if you want the rest. Athelstan, recently voted, I don't know which 6 Anglo-Saxonists they asked, but recently voted as the best monarch that Britain has ever had, pipping Elizabeth I to the post. And this is Athelstan saying, this is your life to St. Cuthbert. The black coloration is because white lead has been used for the faces and it's oxidised and turned silver black. Okay. Now, Athelstan, the grandson of Alfred the Great, was left to pick up the pieces after Alfred, the Lady of the Mercians, Elfleda, and others, Edward the Elder, had started the fight back against the Vikings after Alfred had declared a partition treaty with them. And so you find the Danelaw on roughly the London-Oxford line and a partition. Now, the minute the partition was agreed, the Anglo-Saxons, with Wessex being the last men standing, Alfred reduced as a weakly third son, as the final king left standing, as a guerrilla in the Athelney marshes. And what happens one day, he's busy burning cakes, and he starts having visions of St. Cuthbert. That's because the community of Cuthbert on Lindisfarne have left Lindisfarne. In fact, they haven't. The sculptures show they were always there. But they go on walkabout around the whole of southern Scotland and northern England, showing the relics, showing they're still in nominal charge spiritually. And they do something strange for people running away from the Vikings. They go to Crake, the most southerly house, 7 miles from York. They stage a bloodless political coup, overthrow the Vikings, and take a Dane who's been captured and converted to Christianity as the new leader. And immediately, Alfred sees visions of Cuthbert and starts having somebody to talk to. Okay. Now, Athelstan, by the 930s, is in a position to really begin to make traction with this. He visits the shrine of Cuthbert on his way to invade Scotland in 934 and leaves gifts at the tomb of Cuthbert, including these beautiful embroideries made in Wessex. He's an avid book collector. He was given books from Lindisfarne in Brittany because he tried to help protect Brittany from Viking attacks. This one he gave to Bodmin, where again manumissions freeing slaves were added in its margins when people would come to the churches and in front of those gospel books would swear legally binding agreements to actually give away their wealth and free their slaves and transform the way in which they lived. I haven't time to say that, but there's a weird story there. I'll tell you about it sometime. But in actual fact, the monks of Llanderfyneck, it turns out their nearest neighbours were the monks of St. Catherine's in Sinai, who had launched a donor cultivation programme targeting Brittany, Wessex, Cornwall, Cologne and Trier because they were being pressurised by the Fatimids in Islamic Egypt and needed international goodwill. Plus ça change. Books that he collected or had as gifts, McDurnan from Armagh from the 9th century, stunning book, portable pocket gospel book. This, another Irish pocket gospel book from the 8th century that was modernised in Winchester. This one from Carolingia, a Psalter, again repainted with this and several other miniatures in Winchester in the 920s to 30s. Sculptures and metalwork also attributed to Athelstan's reign. And the Coronation Gospels from Carolingian Lob, which was sent to Athelstan by his brother-in-law, the first of the Ottonian emperors, Otto I. And that book was used by the kings of England as their coronation book. And the collector in the late 16th century, Robert Cotton, who preserved it, had his library in Westminster. He went running down to greet Charles I as he came to Westminster for the first time with this book that he had researched could be used in the coronation. And he knew he was in trouble when the royal barge rowed ceremoniously past him to the next landing bay. And within a year, he was under house arrest with his beloved library door barred to him on a trumped-up charge of rape and extortion. Books open up all sorts of stories about individuals, which in turn open up whole political and faith and cultural situations. Throughout the 10th century, other books are produced around the incredible Benedictine revival that surrounds King Edgar and his reforming bishops Dunstan, Athelwold and Oswald. And here we have the agreement of the English Church with the subservient monk to the Benedictine rule. And here we have the Benedictional of St. Ethelwold of Winchester from the 980s. Now, if you look carefully at this blessing in the bishop's book for Easter Sunday, you'll see that those nuns have got very square jaws and designer stubble. Now, and that the tomb looks rather like a wardrobe on wheels. Now, it's been suggested quite plausibly that this is part of the liturgical drama for the reenactment of the Easter cycle. So the York Mystery Cycle goes right back to this period, and of course the first ever piece of liturgical drama is in a piece composed on Lindisfarne in the 740s, which is copied in the Book of Cerne in Mercia and goes on to inform this. Here we have Athelwold using his book. He, of course, is eternally, immortally holy, and the rest of the congregation and the buildings are all in ethereal tinted drawing. But fortunately, many of those buildings still survive, such as St. Lawrence at Bradford on Avon. I am going to ask, actually, if perhaps I'll come and do an extra next year, just as an add-on, no charge and no anything, if anybody that's interested, if you'd like the next bit. But can I just finish off the early bit, the early half? Okay. Now, this is a girl and a half. This is Queen Emma of Normandy, and the book is the encomium or apologia of Queen Emma in the British Library. Now, around about the year 1000, there's a second wave of Scandinavian pressure on the country, this time organised and royally sponsored. The response of librarians is, oh my God, they're coming again, anthologise. And so you get collections of poetry, such as the Exeter book. You get collections such as the Noel Codex that Beowulf features in, and the monstrous races So you can see part of the marvels of the East up there as well. Let's capture it and put it on our shelves, the scientific miscellany, etc. Because these ones who are coming are definitely not going to go away. Okay, the ones who came in the late 8th and 9th century, many of them are converted now, but what's going to happen if we are actually run by kings? The attempts to buy them off with Danegeld hadn't worked. The Battle of Morden was a noble but notable failure. And so things are looking bad. And to make it worse, the man at the helm is Ethelred Unred, which means the ill-advised, not the unready. But lo and behold, a royal contender does hove into view. After Athelred's death and that of his son, we have our first Scandinavian ruler, King Canute, who becomes king of England in 1016 and adds it to his portfolio along with Denmark and Norway. And for a glorious short period, we're part of the northern Scandinavian trading empire. And things are looking up, strangely enough, for a while. Now, this is a remarkable image. It's in the Benefactor's Book of Newminster and Hyde Abbey in Winchester, and it's an amazing bit of political propaganda. You've got Canute and his new wife, Emma of Normandy, a Norman princess who had been married to Ethelred Unrad and was deeply unimpressed by the experience, and Canute. Her name's Elfgifu. Canute already had a wife, Elgifu, but you know, it helps if you keep their names the same. You haven't got to change it. And basically it means elf given. Pretty soon they start changing it to God-gifu, God given. But basically a queen was often Elfgifu, whatever her actual name was. And here's Emma, an interesting point. When you hold your drapery, girls, like this, it means you're a virgin. It's a piece of Byzantine iconography. So here we have quite blatantly Emma, who's quite happily to be called Elfgifu Mark II. Elfgifu Mark I is off being regent of Norway, by the way, in case you're wondering. And she's a born-again virgin. Let's forget the unfortunate Ethelred episode. But of course, this is a good way of legitimising your rule and keeping a web of patronage and association. And giving gifts, including books, was a big way of doing it. One of the key people they used in that was Edwy the Fat, Edwy Bassan. Here you see him. He was a monk of Christ Church, Canterbury. If you think that all monkish and nunnish illuminators and scribes stayed at home, you're wrong. Alfred Batter, a contemporary in the scriptorium at Canterbury, writes about rock star scribes who, instead of staying home and teaching like they should do, are out on the road having far too much fun and earning too much money. And he seems to have gone round with Canute and Emma, drawing up really impressive charters and doing spankingly stunning books to give as gifts. Do you want to, here he is at the feet of St. Benedict. You'll note that Benedict and he are fully painted, holy, eternal, even Edwy's bottom, which protrudes into the sketchy, tinted drawing temple zone of his fellow brethren in the Canterbury community. What do you think they gave as a present to the wolf? Archbishop Wulfstan of York, busy writing the Sermon of the Wolf to the English. Get rid of these damn Vikings. He gets the prettiest book possible. It's all pastel, it's all sweetness and light, and with a copy of his own polemic against Canute in the back, along with Canute's promise saying, we're really sorry about all that unpleasantness, but just stick with us and we'll make sure it doesn't happen again. Unfortunately, following his death in 1035, it did. I haven't time for... The Anglo-Saxon world map in the scientific miscellany produced at Canterbury under Canute shows a version of classical cartography, but note the attention to detail in the Scandinavian and Hiberno-Saxon realm. The Highlands and Islands, Iceland, etc., all literally making it on to the map big time, as well as the Red Sea, etc. It's an interesting age. We have tombstones with runes in Norway talking about people who were killed as followers of Canute in England. We've got tombs of Viking traders in St. Paul's Churchyard in London, and we've got influences going all over the place, Ireland especially. We've got also churchmen from the continent being brought in. Emma's son by Ethelred, Edward the Confessor, who finally comes to the throne, imported more Normans, Robert of Jumièges as Archbishop of Canterbury, and this incredible book was for him. But he wasn't too impressed by Mother. Mother had gone completely native and was pushing to have Harthacnut, her son by Canute, succeed to the English throne at the expense of her two sons by the English king Ethelred. Edward went so far, it seems, in popular rumour, to allege that Mummy invited he and his brother back home from exile and promptly had one of them killed, and Edward had to get out quick. When he gets to the throne, Mummy pretty soon finds herself under house arrest, and the book she has made by the monks of Saint-Omer in the continent, North France, southern Netherlands, to give her version of events is the encomium of Queen Emma. And here you can see the scribe of Saint-Omer presenting it. And how does Emma have herself depicted? Same style as when she's a virgin, but note that crown. That is the crown that contemporary books normally reserve for Lady Philosophy, when she appears to comfort Boethius, who in the 6th century was wrongly imprisoned and executed by the Arian heretical Ostrogoths for not playing ball. Emma's statement in word and image about unrightful imprisonment, it's interesting, in the book totally fails to mention that she was ever married to Ethelred or that she had sons by him. And I am finishing now, Mary, fear not. Norman conquest, Viking protagonists, Norman protagonists, the Godwinsons who'd married into the Edward the Confessor line, all going for it big time, and we know what happened. Battle of Stamford Bridge, Battle of Hastings. I will just end with one little detail on the tapestry, which if you go to Bayeux and listen to the rather tedious audio guide, which gets you through there in 20 minutes, so that the next people can come in, this is described as an unknown betrothal ritual, whereby a monk or a bishop slaps you round the face. Maybe. Note the date above, Elfgifer. My suggestion is that this is Emma, depicted trying to influence the outcome of the lead-up. She dies in 1052, but she was still stirring it and trying to make sure that Harthacnut would... and what's underneath her? A priapic naked Viking? Perhaps. Okay, right. Well, that's the first 4 chapters.
Thank you for an absolutely brilliant lecture. You've both given us a dynamic panorama of English history, but you've also completely transformed the way we can think about certain manuscripts. To think of the amazing decorations of the Lindisfarne Gospels that are so familiar to all of us as a new bringing together of discordant, diverse elements that no one had brought together before. It's almost as if they're too familiar and we can't appreciate what a revolutionary step that was. I'm going to give time for 2 questions, only 2. Then there's a drinks reception and a chance to buy Michelle's book and have it signed and maybe ask questions you didn't have a chance to ask. So 2 questions.
Make them good. Okay.
Apart from your book, obviously, where is the best place we can read up about all this sort of stuff that's coming to Brittany and all this
I haven't published that yet. I have done a few articles about my Sinai work, but my next book out will be the biggie on Sinai. If you Google my name, and some articles will pop up, including Eastern influences on some of the Sinai stuff is in that. But yeah, that will be out hopefully in 2 years' time. But no, the Breton stuff is something I discovered at the Sinai end in the work I've been doing behind the scenes there.
And a question there.
In your opinion, what would you say is the most useful manuscripts ever produced in Britain?
The most beautiful or useful?
Beautiful.
Lindisfarne.
This was the perfect question to end on. I thank the audience for 2 wonderful questions. Let us thank Michelle again, and also sign up for next year's talk already for an amazing lecture. And as I said, books available downstairs and a drinks reception. Thank you.
Thank you.